Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sovereign Lovestream.
Hello. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
We're grateful to have you all here again this week. Thank you for joining us.
I'm Danny Panzella.
And I'm Vanessa Velez. And this week we're talking about rocking the boat in our relationships. And why we think it's okay to rock the boat. And
not only okay, but important to rock the boat.
It's definitely beneficial. And I know a lot of us are raised with the idea of not rocking the boat, not causing problems. So we're here to talk about some myths associated with that and some suggestions on ways to consciously rock the boat.
I have no problem rocking the boat. So historically, in my relationships, I'm kind of a very, I don't want to say domineering, but in some ways, yeah, like I'm a dominant personality. I have a very big personality. I have a big ego. And so I have no problem asking for what I want, trying to get what I want, even manipulating at times to get what I want. So I have no problem making other people feel uncomfortable. And this is something I'm working on, obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but it's something I'm working on. But so I've never really had the issue of like, oh, I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to express my opinion because it might rock the boat. And, obviously that has to some degree benefited me in my activist career, right? Because obviously activists aren't afraid to rock the boat. We want to rock the boat to create positive change. But that hasn't always been true for you, has it?
No, I am. Well, it's interesting because I think that I come from a family where we do have, we grew up with this dynamic of wanting to talk things out. Our family had family meetings when there was a big issue at hand. And so I'm kind of used to that. But in my first marriage, I rocked the boat a little too much and it caused a lot of issues where my partner didn't want to talk about things. And it kind of taught me to shut down a lot of myself, to stop asking for things. And I think as a society, sometimes women are trained to believe that they should remain silent. I come from a Mexican family, and in Mexico, there's this saying, "Calladita te ves más bonita," like you look prettier when you're quiet. And it's this idea of shutting women down, of women not having a voice. And so I've definitely been in both areas. I have this, I do think it's important to talk about things, but there have been many times where I felt that it was better to just stay quiet. And when Danny and I got into our relationship, he does have a very loud personality, a very dominating personality. And it kind of, and I was also recently separated. So I kind of was already coming from this place of maybe it's better to just be quiet. Maybe it's better to just, let things slide and not cause too many issues, not rock the boat. And that proved to be very destructive in our relationship. And we were both unhappy. So
you would think, right, that I would be happy getting my way all the time. But because that was happening, she was unhappy, which then makes me unhappy, right? Because even when sometimes we're subconsciously selfish, right? For me to want to, or just kind of take for granted, right? It's not even so much where I was like selfish and like everything's going to be my way, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
It was more like just kind of subconsciously not taking her into consideration, not considering her feelings, like just assuming she's going to be cool with whatever I want to do. And then if she doesn't voice an opinion to the contrary, oh, I guess she is, like she is cool with it. Like, obviously it's not a conscious thought. This is all taking place subconsciously.
And
So
sometimes there's also this idea that you know better, right? If I'm doing this, it's because I know this is the best course of action. And if my partner doesn't agree with it, it's because they don't fully understand it yet. You know, maybe they're just not there. Maybe they don't understand that this is what's best. So I'm going to do it anyway, regardless of whether my partner is fully on board or not. And
we always think our point of view is the best point of view, right? I mean, that's just kind of a natural position. If we didn't think it was the best, we wouldn't have it as a point of view.
Exactly. So one of the, I guess we can get started on one of the reasons why people are afraid to rock the boat. And ultimately, if we break everything down, it comes down to fear of rejection. We're afraid that if we start an argument with our partner, an argument means they don't love us. If they disagree, if we fight, there's the potential for our partner to abandon us. Oh my God, if I cause too many arguments, you know, there's the stereotype of the nagging wife, right? I don't want to be a nagging wife. I don't want to argue anytime I disagree with anything. I'll just let it slide and I'll be fine. And as we mentioned earlier, this can lead to feeling disappointed, feeling unfulfilled in the relationship. The more you hold back about what you want, the more resentful you're going to be, and the less authentic you are. The less authentic you are in your relationship, the less you feel like yourself. So it's absolutely important. I was reading earlier a quote about this idea that we're afraid that conflict is going to break us apart. And really the only thing that it's breaking apart is all the barriers, all of the defense mechanisms that we have in place. And so it's not a bad thing to have these conflicts. I think we both have had experiences where not talking about the conflicts have led to increased resentment, pent up anger, frustration, this idea that you're not intimate with your partner if you can't even have an argument. I was in a relationship where I brought things up to my ex-husband and he was just completely silent. And it was frustrating. It felt like either he didn't care or he wasn't really listening. And it just felt like I was unheard and that he didn't want to put the effort into our relationship. So I would have thrived on him arguing back with me at least so that we could work out some of these issues. And I feel like you had a similar situation.
Yeah, I definitely did. My ex-wife also basically just let me have my way all the time. And while that may sound like, oh, that's kind of noble, she's sacrificing herself. In another way, it really was a lack of intimacy. She wasn't communicating with me. She just allowed me to steamroll over her and always have my way. And I never got any feedback, or not that I never got any feedback. And we're both responsible, right? We both co-created that situation. I was not the active listener. I mean, I'm still not, but I'm trying to practice it more, where I actively listen to what Vanessa's needs are. And that's something I didn't do in my first marriage. I did just kind of steamroll over, and she had to compete with my big personality to be heard. And I get that was probably really exhausting for her. And at some point she just kind of gave up, and I'm not willing to listen. She's not willing to communicate because I'm not willing to listen. And the intimacy just dissolved. And over time, it just kind of became a relationship that was really just habits. It was just, we were habitually used to doing things a certain way. We had these patterns and we just existed in those patterns. Like, I mean, I feel like that's probably what they mean when they say like ships passing in the night. You're just you're living together. You're really more roommates, and you might even be friends, but you're certainly not intimate partners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in our relationship, this led to a ton of conflict in the beginning.
Yeah.
We went through so many years of conflict because I had been in a relationship where I didn't have a voice. And there were moments in our relationship where I was allowing that to happen. And once I would recognize the patterns, I would fight back. I would say, no, I'm not willing to just sit through this. I'm not going to be quiet about this. I don't want this type of relationship. So I'm going to speak up. And to have his ideas or behaviors challenged was difficult at first. It felt like an attack. It felt like I was just nitpicking on things. And because of his lack of listening skills, there were many times where it just evolved into this huge blowout that would, we would end up yelling about things that had nothing to do with the initial conversation. Luckily, over the years, we've kind of learned how to communicate those things effectively. So it can be a difficult situation if you're, just cruising along. And it's one of the things I've said about our relationship. We've gone through so much difficulty, but I'd rather have that than just cruise by on this relationship without really feeling anything, without having any it's sad, I think, when you're in a relationship and you don't even feel like talking to your partner about your most intimate thoughts or feelings or desires. You're just like, he's not going to listen, so what's the point? And then what type of relationship is that, right?
Yeah, again, there's no intimacy. I think for me, there was like this kind of dualistic thing. Yes, when she would bring up things, I absolutely there were times that I felt attacked, but at the same time, I think that's what I longed for in my previous relationship, where I wanted her to kind of fight back a little. I wanted there to be give and take. I wanted the intimacy of that give and take, right? Obviously I'm not saying I wanted to scream and yell with her the way we did, but I did want there to at least be that the back and forth debate, right? It's something I can respect. And I think a lot of it is subconscious, right? Some of this happens without us even really consciously realizing it. And it's only after the fact when you kind of think back on it, right? I wanted her to fight with me a little bit, to express herself and to kind of get into it, because I can respect that, right? I can respect her standing up for her boundaries. And so that's why, even though I did at times feel criticized, I also respect the fact that you stood up for your boundaries and we're not just willing to let me steamroll over you, because now it feels like we're equals in a partnership rather than just kind of one person leading the way and the other one following.
And I think to a certain degree, there's a part of the ego that enjoys having full control and saying, I run the show here and what I say goes. And that's on one level, but there is another level of yourself that's feeling like I'm just running the show here. So, where's my partner? We do want equal partners. We want someone to work with, to create this life with, not just someone that we're dragging along or, I don't know, just is in the background somehow.
Yeah, I think that's what you're describing is really your authentic self, your true self wants a loving, we crave connection with other people. And you want that loving connection, that equal partnership. But the ego gets out of control sometimes, and the ego wants to be the dominant one. Why? Because the ego is insecure and it's afraid of being rejected. It's afraid of not being in control of the situation. So for me, I had a lot of rejection issues with my mom. I felt rejected. And I've worked through a lot of that. But it really was some classic stuff that was coming into play, archetypal stuff where me feeling rejected by my mom made me feel like I was going to, dominate in my romantic relationships, and then I wouldn't have to feel that rejection anymore, right? I'm the one in control. If anyone's doing the rejecting, it's me. And it took me years to be able to integrate that, understand where it was coming from my relationship with my mom, and integrate it to and heal it to the point where I no longer have to dominate Vanessa to feel like I'm in control. We can have a true partnership with true communication, true connection, and I can feel safe inside that true connection and safe enough to be vulnerable.
Exactly. And I think one of the big I don't know, truths that has to come into play when having this type of relationship is that you yourself are 100% responsible for your own happiness. And like Danny said, if you have this childhood wound that you're expecting your partner to heal in some way, you are never going to be happy. It's never going to work. And it takes, first of all, looking at yourself, looking at the things, your actual needs and where those needs come from. If you can recognize, hey, this is something that is a result of my relationship with my mom and I'm still working to overcome, you can communicate that, be vulnerable and communicate that, and your partner may choose to help you with that, but it no longer falls on your partner's responsibility to do that.
Yeah. I actually wanted to pop this comment up there. I think you can know your true self. I think it is probably a lifelong process. I think that Riddle My Fiddle is kind of right in that many people are lost and don't really understand their true self. I think a lot of people believe their ego is their true self. And in fact, your ego is really just it's a combination of things, right? So your ego is important. You need your ego to keep you alive, to protect you. But sometimes if it's out of balance, if it's out of control, your ego becomes a kind of like a shield of defense mechanisms, psychological defense mechanisms that, yeah, they can protect you from hurt, but they also cut you off from your true self, from your feelings, from your heart. And you can't really experience love and connection in as powerful a way as when you're vulnerable. So I think, yeah, you can know your true self. It probably, for a lot of people, takes a lifetime to really do that, to really delve deep, go inside, know who you really are, understand what's defense mechanisms and what's your true desires of your authentic self. I think it's a lifelong process.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on it?
No, I absolutely agree. I think we live in a world where we are kind of distracted so much, and our defense mechanisms are triggered on a daily basis. So it does become easy to fall into this belief that that our ego is your true self. This is who I am. My defense mechanisms are who I am. It's safer to be my defense mechanisms than to be my authentic self. And, being in a true partnership is amazing, especially when you're able to be your authentic self. I would hate to be in a relationship where I'm walking on eggshells or trying to hide aspects of myself because I don't want my partner to judge me or to know about certain things. I'm afraid of rejection. So all of, I think it just leads to a definitely more intimate relationship.
Yeah. And somebody else said, Riddle again. No, she doesn't dominate me. Now we're in an equal partnership. That's the beautiful thing about it, right? Because that would be out of balance too. If the balance of power shifted from me to her, then it's going to be just as toxic, and maybe just in a different way, because maybe she's going to rule the relationship in a different way, but that's just as toxic. The idea is to get to where you're a true partnership, where you're both being open and vulnerable with each other. And
there's no need to dominate anyone because you're in a safe relationship. You can communicate about pretty much anything. Kind of going back to the idea of being responsible for your own happiness, I think we do put a lot of pressure on our partners to make us happy. We tend to say things like, you irritate me, or you frustrate me, or you make me angry when you do this thing. And it's so hard to let go of the idea that someone else can have control over your feelings. And perhaps it's because as children we're taught that, you have a feeling and your parent is like, no, that's wrong. You don't feel that way. We don't get angry in this house, or we don't get this. You're angry or you're frustrated, go to your room. I don't want to hear about it. And so we kind of are taught that we don't have control of our own feelings. And so when we're in a relationship, we just assume this person is responsible for my happiness. If he's doing something wrong, then it's going to make me unhappy, and I need him to change his behavior so that I can be happy again. And if you subscribe to that belief, you're going to spend your whole life trying to convince your partner to be something that they are not. And you're absolutely giving away your true power in that moment.
And ultimately, it's going to fail. It can never work. Only you can own your emotions, understand them, and decide which ones are you're going to focus on and which ones you're going to not reject, because you don't want to reject your feelings. You want to, kind of, actually, maybe you should talk a little bit, because you're much better at this than I am. I have a hard time sitting with negative feelings. I have a hard time, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to feel the negativity, the sadness, the depression. It always turns to anger for me. For me, it's easier to take like fear or depression about the state of the world, right? Like all the things happening around us. We're looking at like forced vaccines and all these things that like all this tyranny around us. It's depressing. So I tend to funnel that depression into anger, which for me feels a little bit better than depression. But it's still not good for me to dwell in that anger. Dwelling in the anger is not going to stop forced vaccines from coming. If anything, it adds to it, because it creates a resistance to it, and what you resist persists. This is the law of attraction. So I have a hard time sitting with those negative feelings. Vanessa is much better at it than I am, so she should probably explain that.
I think I feel like the reason why it seems like the reason why you probably end up sitting in that anger for so long is because you're not looking at the other feelings, the fear, the frustration, the feeling this lack of control over the situation, over the state of the world, right? And those feelings are really uncomfortable. We don't like to have those feelings. And as I said before, a lot of us are raised to believe that those feelings are all bad. So just sweep them away, move them out of the way. Even in the spiritual community, there tends to be this spiritual bypassing, right? It's positive vibes only. It's only love and light. And we can't have the love and the light without the darkness, without those quote unquote negative feelings. They're just the other sides of the same coin. And for me, I am very comfortable in the uncomfortable feelings. I have learned to just accept them. If I feel fear, I recognize that I feel fear. What am I afraid of in this moment? What's the worst case scenario that can happen? And how would I handle that? And sometimes just allowing myself to feel it, just allowing it to be real. And sometimes even saying it out loud. We were having this conversation, I think yesterday, and I was saying how I had this feeling of jealousy at one point. A friend of ours was pregnant, and I've been trying to get pregnant for years, and I had this feeling of jealousy. And my initial reaction was like, oh no, jealousy is a bad feeling. Let me just usher it away. Let me just push it out. I don't want to feel that way. And then I actually was like, okay, this isn't going to help either. Why am I feeling jealous? All right, well, it's not that I don't want somebody else to be happy. It's that I feel sad because I still haven't been able to get pregnant. And I allowed myself to feel that way. I said, okay, it's really just sadness. It's not jealousy. It's not anger towards anybody else. And I came into the room and I told Danny, I was like, can you just hold me for a minute? And he put his arms around me and I just started crying. And I don't think he even knew what I was crying about. I just said, can you just hold me? And I cried it out, and it lasted for a couple of minutes. And then I was like, all right, I'm done. Like I felt it. I allowed it to express itself in this conscious way, because I could have expressed it in anger or, blocking a friend who announced their pregnancy because I feel a certain way about it. But instead, I just allowed myself to feel those feelings of sadness, and it passed and it was over. I don't have that negative reaction to, anybody's experience. If I'm sad that I don't have it, I can recognize that sadness, and it doesn't affect my relationship or my reaction to anybody else. And it's kind of in allowing yourself to feel the real feeling, because we do have this defense mechanism. I feel depressed, let me switch it to anger, because anger I can control. Depression can control me. And so I don't want that to happen. I'm going to switch it over to anger. And now I know what I can do. I can say something about it. I can argue with somebody about it. I can, take over the situation and not allow this feeling to overwhelm me. And I think sometimes it's okay to allow the feeling to come through, to feel it and express it in some way. Obviously, you're going to try to express it in a way that doesn't hurt anybody else. So I wouldn't go to my friend and say, I'm so upset that you're having a baby and I'm not. But instead, I would say, hey, this is how I feel about this thing to my partner, and communicate that. This is how I'm feeling today. He can comfort me. He can hold me for the time being. And then that's it. It really is that simple. And I think a lot of us are so afraid to feel the feelings that we miss out on how simple it really is, because it's the same thing when a child is having a temper tantrum. If you just empathize with the child and say, okay, I see that you're really upset. Do you want to tell me what you're upset about, what you're feeling right now? Sometimes they just have to say it, and then that's it. It's over. We've had this experience with Xander where he'll get worked up and start crying about something. And we ask, okay, can you explain what you're feeling? Are you feeling frustrated? We give him a few options to try to pinpoint what his feelings are. And, sometimes he just doesn't know. And we're like, all right, is it just that you're overwhelmed right now and don't really know what you're feeling? And he'll say yes, and then it's okay. We felt the same way at certain times. It's okay to have overwhelming feelings. And then once we kind of have this short conversation, it's over. That's it. We've empathized with the feeling. We've allowed it to come through. And then that's it. There's no reason to bury it or ignore it.
Sometimes then we just hug him. And after a minute or two, he feels better. And he's like, I don't even know what I got so upset about. And it's like, it's okay. Sometimes that happens. Riddle asked another great question, and I want to pop this up here. And actually, Star Cloud answered it. So I'm going to give you a second here. How can one know his or her true self? I recognize that I'm not a body, a name, a brain, or anything of that sort. I know that much. I am much more than that. But how can I know who I am? And then Star Cloud said, life equals feeling. Riddle, that's exactly how you know who you are, is by observing your feelings. This is the lesson that I have been learning over the last couple of years, that Vanessa has been desperately trying to help me learn. You are your feelings. That doesn't mean that. So I grew up in the Christian church, and kind of one of the themes that was drilled into my head was that feelings aren't real, that feelings can lie to you. Like if you feel like God doesn't love you, you feel depressed or you feel unloved, that's not true. The church would say that's a lie of Satan, and you just have to trust and know in your mind that God loves me. So even when I feel it, God loves me. Now, I agree with that. God does love us regardless. I do believe that. But what that does is you end up suppressing or feeling shame about those feelings. So here I am feeling kind of depressed, like I feel unloved. And then I'm like, oh no, I feel unloved. I'm sinning right now because I feel unloved. Like now I feel shame about the fact that I felt the emotion. But the emotion is telling me something about who I am. I have some kind of feeling. And now in my 40s, I was able to trace it back to some very simple things that my mom had done when I was very little, and I just interpreted them in the completely wrong way. My mom had a period where she joined the gym and was going to the gym every day after work. And I took that at my age, I just took that to mean like she didn't want to have kids. Like she wanted to go live her own life and do her own thing. Now, as a parent, I understand she needed some time to herself. She just needed some self-care time, right? But as a kid, I interpreted that as her not loving me, as kids being an annoyance to her, and I just got to get out of the house, get away from you kids for a while. And maybe she said something like that once in a moment of frustration or anger, right? And I took that to mean this is how she feels all the time. And I made that my story. And that feeling or that belief, a false belief, carried through my whole life, this feeling of insecurity that like my mom doesn't love me as much as I think mothers should love their kids, right? It was a false belief based on that experience.
And so it creates this idea that you're not worthy of being loved. And now you have to prove your worth, or people have to love you in order for you to know that you're worthy of love.
But the emotion of feeling unloved, the emotion of depression of feeling unloved was like a signal. It was a red flag. It was my subconscious saying, hey, there's something to look at here. There's a problem here. You feel depressed because you feel unloved. We have to figure out why. So you can know yourself. It's like really crazy, right? Because this is the lesson you've really been trying to teach me for many years. And it's been so resistant. And I've been so resistant because I don't want to face those negative feelings. I don't want to think about the fact that I feel like my mother didn't really love me as much, right? Who wants to think about that and feel that again? I'm afraid of feeling that depression again. But when I finally was willing to look at it and trace it back to the source, oh my God, it's all based on this thing that I misunderstood as a kid. And none of it was really true. My mother did love me, of course. I mean, she has passed since, but you know, my dad tells me, yeah, your mom was obsessed with you guys. You were her whole life. So yeah, maybe there was a period where she needed a break for an hour a day. I mean, I certainly understand that now, right? But here I built this whole story. So that's how you know who your true self is, by looking at your emotions and tracing back where they come from. And, you know, it could be good emotions too, right? We're not just made of traumas and our bad experiences. We're also made of our good experiences. You know, I can trace back I love road trips. I want to get Xander. He doesn't like being in the car, and I want to take a road trip. I want to go across the country. I want to go to the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone Park. I want to show him all these things. Why? Because my dad took me on a road trip, and it was like one of the best vacations I've ever had in my life. To drive across the country, camping, seeing, you know, animals in the wild, and it was an amazing experience, and I want him to have that. And so, you know, we also know ourselves through our positive experiences and the emotions that lead us to those positive memories, right? So
yeah, I
hope that makes sense.
I think we have a tendency to look at emotions, like you were saying, that feelings aren't real, right? And it's true. Perhaps the reason why we feel certain things aren't real, you having this feeling of unworthiness because you misinterpreted something, and that may be false. But the feeling is there to bring attention to something, to say, hey, you're feeling this way, let's look at that. You know, there's a reason why. You know, it's like a car with all these lights on, right? When your gas light comes on, you need to go refill on gas. When, you know, your whatever lights come on, your check engine light, you know that you need to get some maintenance. So it's the same thing. That's really what your feelings are. It's like a guidance system of saying, hey, let's look at this thing. There's something here that isn't quite in harmony, and maybe we can look at it and figure out where the disharmony started, where this is coming from. And it's a lot easier. I mean, we have this fear of those negative feelings, and by suppressing those negative feelings, we actually hold on to these stories that we're telling ourselves. Danny, for all of these years, was telling himself a story that wasn't 100% accurate, all because he was so afraid to face that feeling. And it sat with me for 40 years. I had that false belief that my mother didn't love me because of that silly little thing. And 40 years I avoided looking at it. Or not 40 years. I'm 43. So, all right, like 30 years, right? Probably it happened around when I was, you know, maybe 12, 13, something like that. So yeah, like for 30 years, I just avoided looking at it. You know, Amanda, feelings are a complete waste of time and do nothing to improve physical reality. I absolutely, for a long time, I would have totally agreed with you. But now I think that feelings can be the fuel to fuel action that improves physical reality. So if you see something that you don't like, you're going to have a feeling. You're repulsed by it. You're angered by it. You're saddened by it. You have a reaction. And that feeling can motivate you to do something to change it. I look in the mirror and my gut's getting too big. And I'm like, oh God, I don't like the feeling of this. I don't like feeling bloated or whatever. And so that can motivate me to get more exercise or to change my eating habits to get rid of that, right? So feelings, like Vanessa said, they're like your guidance system
So they're useful for that, for sure, right? Because they can spur you on and they can be the fuel, right? To give you the will to take the actions that you need to change physical reality.
And I think what people
that's a great comment, though.
Yeah, I think what people tend to shy away from is reactiveness. Reactivity isn't helpful and isn't beneficial. There are many times that I have a feeling, I'm frustrated by something, I'm upset about something, I'm hurt about something, and instead of looking at the feeling itself, I react in anger. That is not beneficial. That's not helpful. It causes all sorts of confusion, all sorts of misunderstandings, because you're reacting out of those feelings instead of looking at the feelings and paying attention to where they're stemming from. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think that does make sense. And I think that answers Amanda's next question, which was, how do you go from feelings to doing?
Yeah.
Right? By looking at the feelings, okay, what is this feeling trying to tell me? And I think that's exactly the problem with our society. Amanda, you also made a comment earlier about people not wanting to hear the truth. And I think that's true. Like, people don't want to spend the time to look at the truth of the matter, like I did for 30 years, looking at the truth of my relationship with my mom. We don't want to look at the truth. And so that keeps us from being able to turn the feeling into productive action, right? So by changing our habit from reacting, she says something that reminds me of something my mother said, and I get, what? You don't love me? Fine. And I throw something across the room, or I break up with her and I storm out, or, you know, whatever. Like, that's reaction. Or I could say, okay, I'm feeling from what you just said that you don't love me. And you can respond to that and be like, no, babe, I love you. This is what I'm trying to say. And I'd be like, okay, so where does that feeling? Why do I feel like you don't love me?
Yeah.
That reminds me of something my mom said. I mean, and it's not going to happen always right there in that moment, right? It could take days, weeks, months, or years in my case to really be able to trace back where it came from. But honestly, I think it won't take years if you really set your intention that you want to figure it out. I think it happens. And God, the universe, whatever your belief system is, I think will help lead you to that truth if you really diligently seek it. But yeah, I think that's how you can convert emotion to action, by not reacting to, like, right? Like, an example could be the rioting during the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Something happens, and I know, like, I probably believe most of the rioters were probably COINTELPRO, or at least led by COINTELPRO. They were infiltrators who want to derail the protests, right? Because I certainly am a Black Lives Matter supporter, and I believe in protesting. I've done much of it myself. But so there's the peaceful protesting, there's the marching with a message, and then there's the reaction. Like, that's a thoughtful way to respond to police murdering people. And then there's the reaction, which is just, I feel anger, I need to take out my anger, I'm going to throw a brick through a window, I'm going to set a car on fire, or something like that. So there's the that's really, I feel like, a real life, example of how, as a collective society, sometimes we don't process our feelings in a healthy way. We don't examine them, we just react to them. And we do that on an individual level also. And I think that's the reason why many people don't want to hear the truth, because then that requires taking a hard look at themselves, sitting with those uncomfortable feelings. And I'm saying this not to judge anybody that does this. I'm saying this because this is how I have lived my life. And I am just now learning. I mean, that's what this podcast is about, is us sharing the things that we're doing right now and learning as we go. And hopefully somebody else gets benefit out of it.
Yeah.
But
I wanted to bring up this one. What if both partners carry damage from childhood? How do we talk about it and actively recognize it? And that is exactly what Rocking the Boat does and is. I think it is recognizing, paying attention. Again, ultimately, it does come down to paying attention to what we're feeling and why we're feeling it. We've taken, we've gone through so many years of reacting towards each other. It took a lot. Our relationship got to some really terrible places because we were just reacting. We were recently talking about, what was the example we were talking about earlier? about just agreeing with things. Oh, like for example, Danny likes to go out, and in the beginning of our relationship wanted to go out every weekend, to go out drinking, partying, being around a lot of people. And I get very overwhelmed with people. I am constantly exhausted when I'm around people. I'm very empathic and I can feel a lot. So we would go out, and because I didn't want to say anything, I didn't want to rock the boat and appear unfun, or I didn't want him to be bored by me, because those were my feelings of insecurity that I didn't want to look at. So I'm like, all right, I got to go out and be fun. Otherwise, I'm not going to be worthy of his love and affection.
And I was certainly obnoxious about it because I love to be out. I feed off that energy of the crowd. And and there's nothing wrong with that. But because of that, I was only concerned with what I felt and what I wanted, which was to party. And so I didn't take into consideration because she didn't really communicate. Yeah, that's a little too much for me. At least in the beginning, she didn't communicate.
Yeah.
It got to a point where it became so overwhelming that she had to, but it led to a lot of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, in order to handle that, I had to go out and drink a lot. Like, I felt the need to just drink, and if I drank, I could feel like I could handle all of the energy, and it would turn into explosive arguments. Every little thing was a fight. We had so many nights where we would go out only to come home and just argue the rest of the night, and sometimes fight for days over something that happened when we went out, all because I was still struggling to communicate, this is not really the lifestyle that I want, you know?
And it got so bad that there were times that we were arguing, we come home from the club at 2-3 in the morning and be arguing, and neighbors would call police on us. Like, that's how bad it got. It got toxic, especially with the alcohol involved.
And it was us just not processing the things that we were feeling, right? If I were vulnerable enough to say, hey, I'm afraid that if I don't do what you want, I'm not going to be loved. And that probably came from my own experiences in childhood where, not that my parents ever said, if you don't do what we want, we won't love you. But sometimes when parents put certain pressures on you, you kind of get that impression, oh, I'm going to disappoint my parents. If I disappoint them, they're not going to love me as much. Or, for us, it's very important to communicate to Xander, it's okay if you don't want to do this. We're still going to love you. We're okay. It's up to you. We want you to be who you are. And those are such important words to say to your kids. And I know now I have a great relationship with my parents. I know that regardless of what decisions I make in life, they'll always support me and love me. But I think as a child, that wasn't spoken to me as much. And I did have this belief that if I didn't do what others wanted, I wouldn't be loved. And so I went along with those things. Danny also had this feeling that he had to prove his worthiness, that he had to, he felt unloved. And if anybody rejected him in any way, he would take that as a sign that the person didn't love him.
Oh, yeah.
And these were all childhood traumas. I mean, it took years of us going to therapy, of reading tons of books, of working with plant medicines to finally get to the core of those issues and recognize that a lot of the things that we were acting out in our relationship were just childhood traumas. And it's hard to notice that. It's hard to recognize that some of your behaviors are a result of something that happened when you were a kid. And to finally be able to say, hey, you know what? I don't love going out and drinking every weekend. It's really overwhelming. I work a 9 to 5. I have to commute during rush hour. I'm always around people. I just want to be able to have a nice weekend at home where it's just the two of us and we can talk with each other quietly and intimately and not have to try to scream to be heard, in a crowded bar. And once we were able to do that, we could actually, work out a process in which we both get what we want, right? Where we could, compromise, and some weekends we spend at home and other weekends we go out, and it just, it's a different dynamic once we understand each other's needs.
Yeah. And are willing to respect each other's needs, because that's another part of it. You can understand, okay, I could have understood, all right, she doesn't like going out every weekend, but I want to go out every weekend. So tough. Either we go out or you stay home, but I'm still going out, right? I could have taken that path. So it's not just a matter of respect, of recognizing. It's also a matter of being willing to respect the needs of your partner. And obviously we can make the assumption that if you're in a relationship, you want to do that. I think sometimes we just don't always realize that we're not doing that, right? Because sometimes we feel like, especially when the ego pipes up, you have the right to go out every weekend if you want to. What, she's gonna stop you? You know,
she doesn't want you to be happy.
Right, like that's sometimes the story our egos tell ourselves are stuff like that. Like, well, she doesn't really love you if she's not going to go out with you every weekend. And it's like, okay, but what about you then? Do you really love her if you're going to force her to go out every weekend? Come on, ego, calm down. It's all right.
and I think, yeah, I think we have this tendency to be quiet, to not say these things, and then years later we express it, and maybe it'll be a point where you recognize you're not as compatible as you thought you were. But I feel like I'd rather know that than to stay in a relationship where we're not compatible and we're just pretending to be compatible.
Yes,
having to fake something that isn't there.
Where on the outside it looks like to friends and family you guys are this great couple, but there's no real intimacy there. Yeah, I wouldn't want that. Melissa is a veteran, married 43 years. Congratulations, Melissa, and thank you very much for that compliment, because coming from a veteran of marriage, I mean, that's awesome. So thank you. We appreciate that you're getting something out of this. And Amanda had another question. Journaling is a great way. One of the tools we've been taught by one of our mentors is that when you're having a negative emotional reaction, ask yourself, how old are you? Then just kind of pay attention to the thoughts that pop in your mind. When you speak to your subconscious mind, you can actually do this. Speak to your subconscious mind and just ask, like, how old are you right now? And a memory might pop into your head. This happened to me the other day. What was the memory that popped into my head from childhood? Oh, about one of the experiences I had at church where I actually got thrown out of a church over some of these issues. And I was having a conflict this week with somebody, and I was able to trace back the trauma to that, the rejection of being thrown out of this church for having prayer meetings, of all things. But apparently, my theology wasn't in line with the church's, so they felt like I was leading people astray. But anyway, that was kind of a side note. But if you talk to your subconscious, sometimes it will do that. It will throw up images. You might not hear a voice back, but you'll see a memory of something that you went through, and it may not always be obvious at first. Like, it took me a little while of really thinking about it. Like, how does that relate? How does this incident relate to what's happening right now? And it's not always obvious, but if you're just patient with yourself and just kind of sit with it and be like, oh, okay, yeah, like you're almost like having a conversation with your past self. It's a really interesting process when you're like patient enough to go through it.
Yeah.
I have not been, but I'm starting to like really get into the practice now.
And one of
journaling definitely helps.
Yeah. And one of the things that we recommend everybody, every couple that we know, we've recommended these two books. One is called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, and the second is Getting the Love You Want by Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt. And they are both excellent books. Getting the Love You Want is actually one of the books that it's like a book that we pull out every once in a while in the middle of a conflict, a conversation, when we're struggling to understand something. We can pull out the book, and it just is amazing at breaking down the reasons why we choose the partners that we choose, the psychology behind that, how one of the most like mind-blowing concepts that I got from the book was understanding that we choose partners to sort of reenact some of our childhood traumas. We don't even realize that we're doing this, but there's this idea that we meet our partner and it's like, oh my God, this partner just feels like home. And the reason the partner feels like home is because you've picked a partner that in some tiny way reminds you of your parent.
Or in a big way.
Yeah, but you don't, it's so subconscious, and it's like, it isn't until you actually stop to think about it where you're like, oh my God, this is like, he is my mom or he is my dad. At times, Danny is just like both my parents. It's so funny when I catch it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is really weird. But a lot of times we do choose our partners to sort of reenact those childhood traumas, and we don't realize that that's what we're doing. And then our partner has no idea that that's what we're doing. So they react in the way they're used to reacting. And you're like, oh my God, you don't love me because this is how I felt when my mom did this to me or when my dad did this to me. I like to be by myself a lot. Alone time is so important for me. And in the very beginning of our relationship, when I took alone time, Danny took that as rejection so strongly. He would get so upset by my need to be alone. And he took that as, oh my God, you're rejecting me. You're withdrawing from me. And,
I was very clingy. Like I felt, I would feel like, why does she want to be alone? Why does she want to be next to me? Like
all the time.
Where are you going?
And, I had no idea what that meant to him. I didn't realize that this was triggering a childhood trauma. I was just, enjoying my alone time.
For me, it brought up the emotion of feeling like, oh, my mother's going to the gym again because she doesn't want to be near me. That's exactly, she would go to the other room to read or sit by herself for a little while. And I'd be like, oh, she's leaving me, like subconsciously. My subconscious mind is saying she's leaving you just like your mother left you. She left you to go to the gym to get away from you because she couldn't stand having kids. And that's what would get triggered.
And so we don't recognize a lot of these things. One of the other things we were talking about earlier is how certain things have different meaning, and we don't recognize that. Like we were discussing Sunday dinner. So for Danny, Sunday dinner was.
So let me set the story. I mean, if you saw last week's episode, you already heard the story. But I come from a New York Italian home, and so Sunday dinners at grandma's is like, that's when the family comes together, and it's everybody's at the table at the same time eating together. It's almost a religious ritual. But like it's different for Vanessa. So describe your Sunday dinner.
In my family, we don't really have Sunday dinner. My mom's house is kind of like an open space that anybody can drop in at any time. My family is very close. Like my parents and my siblings and we have a group chat. We say good morning to each other every day. We update each other on what's going on during the day. We have there's just this constant communication. So when we have dinner together, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're all coming together and sitting down at the table at the same time. Whoever's home eats, and if somebody arrives later, they sit down and eat when they arrive. There's no order to it, I guess. But we communicate with each other so much. I call my parents almost every day, and I have a conversation with them almost every day. Whereas Danny can go,
I go weeks or months
without talking to
my dad.
To his dad.
My brother, not so much, but my dad is not as often. But Sunday dinner would be the time that was religious. We would always, be together on that. And then when my grandparents passed, that kind of went away. So when we first started, not when we first started, but when we got to the point where we were going to each other's family's house, I would go over there and everybody would be eating separately. I'd be like, what's happening? Why aren't we all sitting together at the table like a family? This is so disrespectful. Like that's legitimately what I thought. So we just have two very different definitions of what family dinner is or Sunday dinner is, right? And neither one of them is wrong. There's nothing wrong with them all eating separately because they spend a lot of time together. They have a lot of communication. But for my family, Sunday dinner was the time we set aside to make sure, no matter how busy we were all there at Sunday dinner. So for me, it was like, you can't miss it. And everybody has to sit together. And why are you in the living room? Come on, come sit. It was triggering for me, not like on a major trigger, but like on some level, I was like, this is strange to me. But we just had to talk about it. And that's how we realized, oh, this is just the different ways we grew up, and there's nothing wrong with it. Now I don't have to take it personally.
and this is just like a tiny example of so many situations where we misinterpret things just based on our different family dynamics. We have this tendency to think that everybody's family dynamic is just like ours. I had a situation in my previous marriage where my parents have been married almost 50 years, and my dad used to come home from work and my mom would turn off the TV, sit with him, talk to him, tell me about your day. How was work with so and so today, and what did this person say and what did that person say. My mom was like, I knew all of his coworkers without ever having been to his job, without actually meeting some of his coworkers. And just because that was her habit, it was like, I want him to come home kind of unburdened from the day, and then he can fully be present with me, which is brilliant. I think it's a fantastic idea. And when I got married, I tried to do the same thing with my husband, and he would come home and turn on the TV and grab a beer or whatever, and just sit down and watch TV or play video games and completely ignore me. And I was blown away. I was like, what is this? This makes no sense. And it wasn't until after we were like separating that he was like, this is what my parents did. This is the dynamic I had at home. My dad would come home from work, eat dinner, grab a beer, and go watch soccer on TV. And I was like, but what about communication? What about the relationship? And he was just like, I don't see, I don't see a problem with that. That's, my parents have been together for so long. But his mother felt completely repressed and alone, and she felt like she didn't have a place in the relationship, and he just never noticed that because that's how he grew up. And so for us, it was a huge conflict in our relationship, and unfortunately something that we couldn't overcome. Unfortunately for the relationship, because clearly I was meant to find a partner that I could have a different type of relationship with. And again, we had to work at it. My previous
husband,
were
willing to do the work.
Yes.
That's the difference.
My previous husband had no interest in it. He had no interest in going to therapy, talking about anything, reading any books with me, working on anything. And that was ultimately the reason why that relationship didn't work. But in our relationship, it took a lot of work. And I think we live in a society where we don't want to do the work. We want to just be able to turn on Netflix and chill out and not have to think about anything because we're so busy. We're working. We're trying to keep up with the latest trends, with the news, with all of these other distractions that we forget to pay attention to what we're actually feeling, what we're experiencing. And so many people go through life that way, and it's so unfortunate.
I think there's also the kind of Disney idea of if everything's not perfect, then it's not really meant to be, right? Like we have this kind of over romanticized view that if you're meant to be, if you're soulmates or twin flames, that everything will just be easy. You'll come together. It'll be perfect. And no, that's not it at all. I mean, the way you progress, the way you become more your authentic self is by getting triggered, noticing the triggers, working through the triggers. It's your job to trigger your partner, but in a productive way, right? Like you don't want to just be nasty and trigger them that way. You want to, and I'm not saying you want to, but it's going to happen. You're going to trigger them regardless. So, but you can use those triggers as a mirror to really be able to get deep. Like honestly, without some of the triggers of Vanessa, like with her needing her own space, and me being triggered by that, I might not have ever figured out that trauma with my mom, and worked through it and healed from it. My mom died 10 years ago, and it's only like I avoided thinking about her for almost 10 years. It's really only like in the past year that I've been able to heal enough that like I can think about her, and it's not like I'm feeling guilt over the fact that when she passed, like our relationship wasn't that great. Like all those things that I never got to say to her, that for a long time, like I just avoided thinking about her. I wouldn't look at her. I wouldn't have her picture up, anything like that. Like I would make the obligatory post on Mother's Day and her birthday, right? Like I miss you, Mom, or whatever, but I wouldn't think about it. And now I really can like think about my mom again, and I'm much more at peace. It's been so powerful. And I don't know if I could have done that without her triggering me.
it's amazing how much we're repressing throughout our daily lives, and this idea that a perfect relationship is a relationship where there's no conflict is such a flawed idea, because without the conflict you can't break down all of those defense mechanisms. Those conflicts are there to rattle those defense mechanisms so that they fall apart, and the more those defense mechanisms fall apart, the closer you become, because you're now dealing with the authentic parts of yourself, the authentic parts of your partner. You get to know them on a much deeper level than just walking around with a bunch of defense mechanisms. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want him to know what I really feel. I'm not going to say this because I don't want him to reject me. And then you start to lose yourself. There's so many people in relationships that don't even remember who they really are. And if it weren't for all of the conflict that we've experienced, we wouldn't be in a place now where we are ourselves with each other. We joke around a lot. We argue a lot sometimes. We are able to tell each other what we really need, what we feel. We're able to tell each other even the uncomfortable things. There are times where recently I was telling Danny, I was like, I was going crazy. I was triggered by this, and I was really frustrated, and I went crazy. And Danny was like, you didn't go crazy. It just all happened in your head. And you're telling me about it now, but what did you do? And I was like, oh, right. I didn't actually do anything. It just all happened in my head.
But she felt crazy for a minute.
I felt crazy for feeling that way, right? But I was willing to share that with him. And in the past, there's no way I would have shared that. I would have been like, I'm just going to keep that to myself. I don't want him to think that I'm a psychopath. I'm just going to deal with it on my own. And it's so freeing. It's so liberating. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why our Lovestream is called Sovereign Lovestream. It's the idea of being your true self, of being free to be yourself in your relationship. We want freedom in our world, in our society, but if we're not willing to put in the work to be free in our relationships, to be free to be ourselves, then we're never going to achieve that on a greater scale.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we've been working on. And I think little by little we're getting there, and we are freer every day because we are working through all of these ideas that kind of have us tied up or thinking that we can't say things or do things.
Yeah.
And the more we break away from those thought patterns, the freer we become.
Bob Marley said to free yourself from mental slavery. I would add to that, or include in the definition of that, emotional slavery. Slavery to our past traumas, where we're repeating patterns that like based on false understandings of things we experienced as kids, and we're still reacting to those past traumas. Part of freeing yourself from mental slavery is freeing yourself from the slavery to those things as well. I can't believe how fast this hour flew by. We can actually go into overtime. We don't mind hanging out if you do. You don't. If you guys want to hang around. Do you think social justices being offended by triggers is contributing to the perpetual immaturity of society? The reason I ask is because if you can't be triggered, you can't figure out what is triggering you or process that trauma. And then she followed up with safe spaces. So yeah, I think to some degree, yes. As a society, like the cancel culture has kind of gotten out of control to where I think, yeah, let me say this. I think your safe space should be here or here. That's your safe space. I don't think we can expect the whole world to bow to us and create a safe space for us where we're going to walk through life and never be offended. Yeah, we need to be offended. We need to be triggered. And by triggered, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to react to the offense. So a cop kills a black man for doing nothing. Eric Garner was killed in a neighborhood that I work in or used to work in. I worked in at the time. For what? For selling loose cigarettes, allegedly, right? So that triggers, and it caused the reaction of Black Lives Matter. Now, at the time, there wasn't really any rioting, but let's say there was, right? So the safe space to me is in your own heart saying, I'm triggered by this. It angers me. It upsets me. It saddens me that that police are killing unarmed people of any color, but especially to a greater proportion, they're killing people of color. But I don't have to react to that. I don't have to go out and harm a cop or even hate a cop or hate cops in general. Now, I've been a cop watcher for 10 years. I am certainly critical of the policing system and the institutional system of statism and institutionalized racism and all of those flavors of collectivism. I am absolutely critical of it. But I can understand that there are police who are not racist, but they don't understand institutionalized racism. And yeah, they follow orders because they think it's for the greater good. Now, I disagree with them. I don't think it's for the greater good. But I don't have to react that way. I can stay in the safe space of my heart and say, okay, I understand. I can empathize with these cops who think they're good apples, but they're still serving a corrupt and statist evil system. So I don't have to react to them. And especially because if you react to them, it hurts you. I think that's really the most important part of keeping your heart a safe space. And then next is your relationship. Then next would be your family. Try to keep that a safe space, and it grows from there. And then your community. And then eventually, if we are all doing it, if we're all practicing this, it can change the whole world. I mean, that's really what we're doing, is we're changing the world by changing ourselves.
Yeah. I also would like to say that I don't think I think triggers are necessary. I don't think that it's our job to intentionally try to trigger others. I understand that. I think sometimes what happens is we forget empathy, and we can recognize that for somebody else, a certain situation may be triggering. And if that's the case, it's their work to figure out what the trigger is, why it's triggering, how they can work through that trigger. And if I care about my fellow human being, I am going to make an effort to help them work through that situation, work through that trigger. Now, if that means imposing something onto me that is an infringement on my own rights, then obviously that's not something I have to accept or may choose to accept. It's, there are always boundaries, but I do believe in the idea of wanting to help our fellow human beings work through those triggers. I could have very, very easily said, oh, you're triggered by me having my own, alone time. Well, tough luck. I'm going to have my alone time anyway. I obviously continue to have alone time, but we had discussions about it. Why are you so upset every time I want to be alone? What bothers you about that? Is it, what does that make you feel? And it wasn't until we had the conversation about it. First of all, Danny had to be vulnerable in order to share the fact that he was hurt by the fact that I was taking alone time. I was empathetic enough to say, all right, I understand that. I'm sorry that you feel like I'm abandoning you or that I don't want to be with you. It has nothing to do with that. I just like being alone. I was working all day. I commuted during rush hour traffic. I don't, want to be around anybody right now. So please don't take that personally. And then...
But I'm your Disney prince, and I should make everything okay. And being in my arms should be enough to console you from the day.
But because we were willing to have this conversation and Danny was able to trace back why this situation was triggering, we could have that conversation and work it out. And then when I go to have my alone time, I make it a point then to not bend over backwards in any way, but because I know that perhaps it might trigger him, I'll walk over and kiss him and tell him I love him. I'm just going to go take a minute and read for a little while. All right. I love you. And that's it. And it doesn't take anything out of me. It's not exhausting. It doesn't make me change my routine in any way. I'm still taking my alone time, but maybe I do want to give him that extra comfort of reminding him that I love him before I go take some alone time. And that changes the dynamic of the experience that he had with his mom wanting alone time, because maybe that's all his mom needed to say before going to the gym. Hey, sweetie, I love you. I'm just going to run to the gym for an hour, but I'll be right back and we'll have dinner together or, whatever. And maybe she did come home and have dinner with you or did things with you. But as a child, the part you remember is her being away, right? Yeah. And so sometimes it just takes this tiny little thing to change the situation or or change the dynamic of it. So if I can do that, if I know that that's what his trigger is, if I can take a moment out of my time and say, you know what, I'm just going to remind him that I love him before I go take that alone time.
And that can be a safe space.
It's very healing. Right? Yeah. And that exactly becomes
a
safe space. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. If we can be empathetic of our peers, of our fellow human beings when we do certain things, if we know that they're being triggered by something, that doesn't mean you have to bend over backwards. That I wouldn't at that point say, oh, well, he's triggered by this, so I'm never going to go take alone time. That would be unhealthy.
Yeah.
I'm still going to take my alone time.
That would be putting my needs above hers.
Exactly.
And that's not a sustainable situation. That's going to lead to bitterness and more conflict down the road. So that's why rocking the boat is so important. You have to rock the boat, because if you don't rock the boat now, the boat's going to sink later.
Exactly. And the idea
That's pretty good. I like that.
The idea of rocking the boat isn't you're just going to rock the boat and let it flip over. No, you're going to rock the boat, and together you're going to work to stabilize it. And that's really what your partnership is, whether it's a romantic relationship, your relationship with your parents, your relationship with your children. It's a matter of, speaking about these things. And a lot of times it's really uncomfortable. But I promise you, once you get through the uncomfortable feelings, it's so much easier, and it makes your relationship so much lighter and easygoing and a lot more intimate. There's more trust, and the more you do this work, the stronger the foundation is, the stronger that connection is. And then you're not as afraid to trigger your partner or to say, this is what I need, this is what I would like for you to do. And, just as a reminder, when you express these things, it doesn't mean your partner is automatically going to do what you want, but you can express those things and your partner has an understanding about why you're upset about certain things. Or like I said, in my situation, that doesn't mean that I'm never going to have alone time, but I can tweak my alone time a certain way so that he does feel loved when I take it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we went into 10 minutes of overtime. We appreciate you hanging around. I see that there's still some more questions coming in. I guess we could take a minute and do a few more. Yes, for sure. I made a film in film school called Masculine Feminine, and it's maybe we'll show it one day. I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to be vulnerable enough to put that out there yet. It's kind of corny, but anyway, the idea of it is it's this couple. They're just coming back from a date, and the guy's dropping her off, and she makes a comment about, oh, do you realize as of today, we've been dating for 6 months, and he's quiet. And so, but we can hear his thoughts, and he's thinking about 6 months. Oh yeah, because it was right after I had the car serviced. And then he goes into this whole tangent about how the mechanic was trying to rip him off. And this is the thought he's having when she says this. She sees that he's silent and like thinking, and she's like, oh my God. She starts freaking out. Am I trying to pressure him? Does he think I'm trying to pressure him into more commitment? And it just kind of really illustrated the way like men and women just think totally differently, and it leads to so much miscommunication. So absolutely. But again, this is where being vulnerable comes in. And by the end of the film, they actually break up because they've just like totally misunderstood each other. And they're like, and the guy is like totally confused. She gets out of the car. She's like, oh, thank you for understanding that I need space. And he's like, okay.
Well, this is actually what happened to us the first time we dated. Danny and I dated 10 years ago. And we dated for about a month, and we ended up breaking up over a silly miscommunication. He asked what my plans were that weekend, and I said I was doing something with my family. And I said something like, I would invite you, but my parents don't really know that I'm dating yet. I come from a very conservative family, and I had just gotten separated from my husband, and my parents had taken it pretty hard. And I hadn't told them that I was dating again. And so I felt weird inviting him. And I was like, I'm sorry, I can't invite you. My parents don't know that I'm dating yet. And he was like, oh, yeah, that's totally fine. I'm not looking for anything serious anyway. I remember him saying anyway.
I thought I said either. Like, so for me, this kind of goes back to the Sunday dinner definition, right? To me, she's saying, I can't be so serious that I introduce you to my family yet. And I'm like, okay, yeah, like I get it. I'm not there either. I was also separated at the time. And so things were weird with that. And so I was like, yeah, I get that. Cool. I'm not looking for anything serious either, is how I remember saying it.
So I heard it as anyway. And I'm like, oh, he doesn't want anything serious. All right, so then what have we been doing this past month? Like, I thought this was going somewhere. I mean, not that I'm ready to like introduce him to my parents and marry him, but that we're like dating each other, that we're committed to dating each other or something. And so I was like, all right, I guess then this isn't anything serious. And I got out of the car, I said goodbye, and then I ghosted him completely.
Poof. I was like, where'd you go?
He tried to text me a few times after that.
For years. We started dating again like 2 or 3 years later. She just ghosted, gone. And I would text her like periodically, and she would just ignore me for days. She'd answer me like 2 days later.
And because I seriously just interpreted that as him not really being interested in a relationship. And I was like, all right, I thought we were dating, because we were potentially going to be in a relationship. So that like we lost a couple of years of our relationship there. And then luckily we did come back at some point.
Yeah. Yes, of course. It can be totally normal or okay to not have that many issues with miscommunication. I hope that's the case. I think that's great. If both your partners are like so well adjusted and have dealt with their childhood traumas that they don't have miscommunications, I think that's amazing. I wish that I could be in that place, right?
And I think
but if you're not having miscommunications because you're not communicating, then that's not the same, right? Like, you want to be communicating, and if you're communicating but not having miscommunications, beautiful, you're doing the right thing, keep doing it. But if you're not communicating, me and my ex-wife didn't have a lot of miscommunication because we didn't communicate. So that's not healthy either, obviously.
And I think that sometimes that can happen if you both come from similar backgrounds, if you have similar styles of communication, it might be a lot easier to communicate. So there are so many different, there's such a huge spectrum of the types of communication that are out there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing your Sunday afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. We had a lot of great comments and questions, and we always appreciate that feedback.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. So thank you for joining us. Let us know what other topics you'd wish to have us cover. We're always looking for topic ideas. And Danny's going to
talk about social media for a second. We're on all the big platforms. You could get us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, of course. But I always like to talk about minds.com and Float app, because especially in the, right now, the big social media companies are openly admitting that they're censoring fake news. And, during COVID, fake news apparently was that vitamin C can help boost your immune system. They consider that fake news, and they were censoring those articles. And of course, we're coming to a place now where they're talking about possibly mandating the COVID vaccine. They're going to be censoring anti-vaccine, what they consider anti-vaccine stuff. So Minds.com and Float app are two apps, social media networks that do not censor. And they also do not sell your information. They are privacy centric. So they don't do all the data mining and then sell it to like the way Facebook does. So if you're interested in privacy and if you're against censorship, these are two great apps to check out. So I always just like to mention that. Please follow us on all our social medias so you can keep up to date. And thanks. And if you felt that this was helpful, it would be great if you could share it. Maybe there's other people in your social networks that might also find it cool. So we appreciate you helping us get our message out further. So thanks again.
Thank you. See you next Sunday, guys.